British Prime Minister Tony Blair said this week that it is time for the West to form a new partnership with Iran and Syria to help stop the violence in Iraq. This comes as reports from Iran indicate that another corner of the axis of evil is nearing completion of its nuclear program. And at the same time, the leaders of Syrian-backed Hezbollah again threatened this week to bring down the U.S.-backed government in Lebanon. But are these the sorts of people the West can trust? And can they really help stop the violence in Iraq? Joining us now from the American Enterprise Institute is Michael Rubin. Michael, you've heard what Tony Blair is recommending, the U.S. negotiating with Iran and Syria. Do you think this has any chance of working?
Frankly, I think Tony Blair is making a huge diplomatic mistake. It has no chance of working. Let's take Syria first. Syria is a country that will never reject its rejectionist stance. Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian president, relishes the position of being the leader of the rejectionist bloc. If he were to join in cooperatively with Middle East peace, which is what Tony Blair was saying, not only in Iraq, but with regard to Israel, he'd have to subsume himself to all the other Arab leaders, namely Hosni Mubarak. It's not going to happen. And lastly, Bashar al-Assad is about to face a tribunal when a UN issues its report, perhaps implicating him in the murder of former Lebanese Premier Rafik al-Hariri. I'm not sure whether we should let him off scot-free.
Now, Michael, I assume that if you go into negotiations with a country, you've got to give them something. What would Syria want from us in return, if in return for them stopping assisting the insurgency in Iraq?
This is the problem. I'm not sure that Syria really knows what it wants. It will talk a lot about the Golan Heights, but in the past we have engaged with Syria, and Syria has spoken a good game, and it's never delivered. And it's a similar problem with regard to Iran, that we can't get into a pattern whereby countries expect reward for intransigence. This old strategy of speaking softly and carrying a large carrot has failed time and time again.
Well, would Syria want to have its dominance reasserted over Lebanon, for example? Would it want to have the Hariri investigation that you mentioned essentially soft-pedaled and pushed aside? Would those be some of the costs, some of the prices that they would want us to pay?
Yes and yes. A lot of people forget that Syria doesn't formally recognize Lebanon's independence. There is no Syrian embassy in Lebanon, and Bashar al-Assad wants in effect a get-out-of-jail-free card with regard to his murder not only of Rafik Hariri, but a number of other reformist journalists. If we engage with Syria at this point, and if we're about to offer them something, it will mean the end of every other diplomatic initiative we have in the Middle East, and it will continue to undercut our security in Iraq.
What about Iran? What is its big goal, strategic goal here? What does it want to accomplish, and what would they want the United States to put on the table if they're going to help us in Iraq?
Well, to start with, I really don't understand why we would even consider, or Tony Blair would consider, putting U.S. national security in the hands of the Iranian leadership. What does Iran want? Tony Blair in his speech, talked about if we just address all of Iran's concerns, then maybe they will be reasonable. History suggests otherwise. Basically, Tony Blair forgets the problem of ideology. Iran is dedicated, the Islamic Republic is dedicated to the export of revolution. Their leader, their ambassador in Iraq, isn't a diplomat, but a member of the Quds Force, this elite Revolutionary Guard unit charged with export of the revolution. He's the former liaison to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Iran also wants, frankly, to run down the clock with pointless negotiations so that they can become a nuclear power.
So we would have to, you think, we would have to accommodate their nuclear ambitions to have any chance of cooperation from Tehran in Iraq, at a minimum?
Exactly. On May 31st, Condoleezza Rice offered to sit down and talk with Iran. The only precondition was the suspension of uranium enrichment during the talks. 4 days later, that was widely reported in the American press. 4 days later, what wasn't reported in the American press is Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, got up and he said in response, why don't you just admit that you've lost? Why don't you just admit that you're weak and your razor is blunt? The fact of the matter is, the Iranians don't approach diplomacy the same way that the Americans do. They don't see it as compromise, they see it as weakness to exploit.
Michael, we don't have a lot of time, but quickly, how do you think the Bush administration is going to respond to this Tony Blair effort and what might come out of the Baker-Hamilton Commission on Iraq? Are they going to accept the dealing with Syria and Iran?
There's going to be some real debate, and there's a lot of real pressure. A lot of people in the administration are convincing themselves they can live with a nuclear Iran. I believe the president is firm in his convictions, but what I fear is that the less we prepare to abide by the president's declarations he's not going to tolerate a nuclear Iran, the less time we have for alternative non-military means to counter it.
All right, Michael Rubin, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.